I would like to ask Dr. Burton to start, and I want everyone to know that he is indeed one of the preeminent scholars on American history and race. I am probably just as anxious as he is for a book he's writing now with Armin Durfner, a great voting rights litigator. They're writing a book on race and the Supreme Court. Dr. Burton has been cited on a number of occasions by the United States Supreme Court. He's indeed well recognized. He was even cited in a case he worked with us back in 2003 or 4. So indeed, he has really got great accolades, but I think among the voting rights community, he's known as really kind of a godsend in many, many ways. His expert reports, if you saw the opinion of the judge in the voter identification case that we were involved in, it quoted him extensively. Indeed, he's well recognized, and as I said before, the United States Congress invited him as one of a very select group of experts to testify to them about the conditions of voting rights affecting people of color in this nation to determine whether or not to extend the Voting Rights Act back in 2006. So let's welcome the Clemson University, formerly of the University of Illinois, a great friend of the African American community throughout, and my good friend, Dr. Vernon Burton, Orville Burton.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for lowering expectations. Can you hear me okay? This is great. Well, I'm a historian, and this is Juneteenth. And since we're virtually in Texas, my friend Gary asked me to take just a few moments to look at this historic date of Juneteenth. It was just a couple of days ago, New York and Virginia announced that they are doing state holidays for Juneteenth. It was just 2 weeks after President Lincoln's announcement on September the 22nd, 1862, of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Union forces abandoned Galveston, Texas. Now, for the 250,000 enslaved people in Texas, the loss of this Union toehold was a disaster for their hopes of freedom. Many had been there, in fact, when the Union was there in Galveston. Instead, having a nearby refuge to flee to, as most other states offered, particularly east of the Mississippi, African-American Texas would really have to depend on the military developments outside of Texas to eventually deliver emancipation. Federal forces once again landed in Galveston. They finally reestablished constitutional authority in Texas on June 18, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, had declared the enslaved persons forever free in rebel-controlled Texas. And after the assassination of Lincoln in 1865, in June, Andrew Johnson, a committed racist and white supremacist, was now president instead of Lincoln. The next day, June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger stepped out on the balcony of the Aston Villa, a home that had previously served as a headquarters for the rebel army in the region all throughout the war, and he read General Orders Number 3. And I'm quoting now from the order, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Ever since this momentous declaration, June 19th has been celebrated as Emancipation Day in Texas with the unique and distinctive label of Juneteenth. Typical celebrations of Texas Emancipation Day will include readings of the Emancipation Proclamations, one of my favorite Texas cultural traditions, barbecue, dancing, singing, and poetry recitations, as the day grew into a wider celebration of Black culture in Texas. The great migration of the 20th century of Black Texans to the Midwest and California have spread the holiday to new regions of the country. After a century of observance by the state's African-American population, and you all, I assume, know about Emancipation Park, bought with the scarce resources of African Americans. And a renewed push for civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s, as Gary mentioned, because of an alum of Southern Texas University, the Texas legislature officially made Juneteenth a state holiday in 1980. Today, the holiday remains one of the many reminders of the complex history of emancipation and freedom in the United States. One lesson we want to look at today is especially important for us. And that is, like the Emancipation Proclamation, laws do not matter unless they are enforced. And that's true today as it was in 1863, in 1865, 1954, 1964, and 1965. Laws do matter, but how they interpret it is essential to freedom, especially for minorities. Now, related to Juneteenth, I often ask students, when did slavery end in the United States? Now, if they answered 1865 with the 13th Amendment, that's not really correct. But the 13th Amendment, though adopted in 1865, was virtually stillborn for a century. Instead, there were black codes, disfranchisement, segregations, and all the trappings of Jim Crow. A better date, I think, for the end of slavery is a century after its adoption, specifically 1968. By that time, the Supreme Court had outlawed segregation and Congress had acted against disenfranchisement, as well as given sanction to laws against discrimination in hotels and restaurants, employment, and housing. When my friend, civil rights attorney Armin Durfner, together asked me to work with him on something we had been talking about ever since we were expert, and I was his expert witness beginning in 1980. I have been working on this book on race in the Supreme Court's due, Gary, out from Harvard University Press this May, and I promise to send you the first copy that I get. In 1968, the case of Jones v. Alfred H. Mayer Company highlighted these events when the Supreme Court brought the 13th Amendment to life and gave new traction to the very first equal rights law, that is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. In that case, the Supreme Court referred to the 13th Amendment as a promise made by the nation. In its decision, the court recalled Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull's 1865 declaration that the 13th Amendment was a trumpet of freedom. Against the backdrop of laws, cases, and other actions, the court recognized the 13th Amendment as a new birth of freedom. But the Supreme Court also recognized that the 13th Amendment is not a one-time historical event whose relevance ended in 1865 or even in 1968, but is a continuing promise to keep working to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery. Time and change over time is fundamental to understanding race in the United States. African slavery and Jim Crow prevailed for 300 years, and they have been gone literally for just over 50 years. Now, if you count a generation as 25 years, you have had 12 generations of white supremacy and now barely 2 generations trying to overcome it. Those numbers are meaningful because the passage of generations means passing on the heritage. That is 12 times of white supremacy are beginning to change it just twice. For African Americans, their descendants, laws defined and ensured a lack of freedom for many generations, even preceding creation of the United States, and continued for many generations thereafter, while also defining lack of freedom for other minority racial groups. In recent generations, law turned and worked to define and ensure the civil rights and to define freedom. As the ultimate interpreter of the law of the land, the Supreme Court has had a starring role in all of this. For generations, the court limited the meaning of freedom and even perverted language to do so. In the Dred Scott case, the court said that when the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, the words all men meant some men. And after the Civil War, the court said repeatedly that in the 14th Amendment, the word equal protection of the laws meant Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement. In the 20th century, starting in the second decade and accelerating in the second and third quarters of the century, the Supreme Court giving the word equal protections of the laws a truer meaning and the court began paving the way and then led the way along with other institutions to dismantling Jim Crow for all races. In the last 30 years, law seems to have changed direction again. After the Supreme Court's resurrection of the 13th Amendment in 1968 and its use in two further important cases, the 13th Amendment has again essentially disappeared from Supreme Court decisions, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that critical piece of legislation, has been under a repeated assault. For the last decade of the 20th century and the entire 21st century to the present in 2020, the Supreme Court has rarely ruled in favor of racial minority claims. Minorities have not lost every case, as they essentially did from 1890 to 1910, and for the most part did in 1870 to 1890, but they have won precious few. A simple scorecard is hardly a basis for drawing conclusions, but is a base for closer scrutiny, for looking to see if patterns exist. When the Supreme Court struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, it created spurious doctrine to do so. The court has 3 times limited or threatened to limit the meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The court has adopted new interpretations of civil rights laws that deny a remedy even where they had been discrimination. In some of these cases, the court has seriously misquoted prior cases to claim precedential support when it did not exist. Whether the court's patterns of decisions in race cases reflect a view that race problems ended when segregation was outlawed or reflect some other reason, it is almost as if the justices suffer from historical amnesia about the tight web of laws and regulations that created the color line. Often expressed in discussion of racial issues as a refrain, "We've come a long way." Part of that refrain may add, "But we still have a long way to go." Racial inequalities reflected across the board. African Americans and other racial minority people have less wealth and more poverty, more dead-end jobs. They have less access to health care, which leads to higher incidence of diabetes and heart conditions and higher infant mortality. COVID-19 kills inordinately more African Americans than their percentage of the population would expect. While homeownership is growing across all racial categories, neighborhoods, and therefore schools are often racially segregated, perhaps more segregated than any time in history. Many predominantly minority schools have fewer resources. Black men and women are targets of racial profiling by police and store security guards, not to mention vigilantes like we saw recently in Georgia. The school to jail pipeline puts more African American men in prison than ever before, and men of other minority races too. On the other hand, there are more African Americans and minority doctors, lawyers, congresspeople, senators, elected and appointed officials, engineers, firefighters, and building contractors and subcontractors than ever. And more African Americans grew up with parents who are doctors, lawyers, politicians, engineers, firefighters, building contractors, and subcontractors. More minorities attend and teach in previously all-white schools, including the most prestigious private university. Although this may put unfortunate pressure on historically Black colleges and universities that play such an important role in United States education. When highway travel calls for an overnight stop, African Americans no longer need to consult their green book. Gas stations, restaurants, and motels have guests of all colors, and the guests of all colors and their children share the common breakfast room and the swimming pool. Interracial couples, heterosexual or other, hardly rate a second look on the street or on television. African Americans have integrated TV shows and commercials, as have other minorities, but to a lesser degree. To be sure, inclusion of minorities on TV is not the same as inclusion in managerial careers or CEOs of corporations. A Black child swimming with white children is not the same as owning the motel. Nevertheless, these changes were unthinkable not so many years ago, and to minimize their significance is a huge mistake. Recognizing that real change has happened proves that more change can and will happen. Historical awareness provides the encouragement and incentives to keep working for change. A myth of the past was that law could not change human attitudes on behavior. The study of American history shows otherwise. Discriminatory laws were doing just that. They were changing human attitudes and behavior to the bad. Today's laws are designed to make our behavior less discriminatory. New generations reared under these newer laws and changing demographics should foster these positive changes. In today's society, it seems inconceivable that we could have anything like a repeat of the decline into Jim Crow. But a complacent failing to heed the opportunity to move forward is also damaging. We as citizens can speed the pace of progress toward equal justice, or we can retard that pace. Historian C. Van Woodward, one of my personal heroes of the history profession, and the writer of history who made me want to be a historian, described one of the dangers of complacency when he testified before the House Judiciary Committee on renewal of the voting rights in 1981. He warned that revolutions such as the first Reconstruction have and can go backwards. 6 years before Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he first announced the new birth of freedom and the unfinished work that he called Americans to do during the war, African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass said the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution together, quote, give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the most comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all the people of this country without regard to color, class, or climate. The 13th Amendment can be the guide. Remember that it's not merely a historical event of the past, but a continuing promise to remove all the badges and instances of slavery and the oppression of 12 generations should produce the change that will benefit everyone in this country of every race and ethnic group and every gender. That is the future. The goal of overturning centuries-long patterns of racial hierarchy and institutional exclusion was monumental. Generations of riveted law and custom had created a deeply rooted caste society with signs of inequality and separation everywhere. This was universally understood at a personal level by both blacks and even whites. The United States has always faced a conflict between ideal and reality. America's ideals of justice, equality, and liberty are for the individual rather than a group. Yet the nation's institutions, led by the state and federal governments, have long violated the ideal, enslaving a group, denying opportunity to a group. This has created a present-day reality that is the very opposite of the ideal. The question for the nation is how to undo that reality. Now, reparations is a political strategy that has rarely been effective because generally the people with money are resentful of having to pay out the money. Reparations work when the people with the money feel they have to pay out. Perhaps the most successful example of reparations is the West German payment of reparations to Holocaust survivors and Israel. West Germany wanted to rejoin the civilized world. The Holocaust survivors needed the money. The problem with reparations is that white America hasn't wanted to pay out. And when you do not want to do something, you can come up with any number of excuses for not doing so. Can this change now? There are a million practical questions. That said, if approached in the spirit of making amends for slavery and post-slavery, police reform, economic reform, perhaps talk of reparations, which could go to black communities or to African-American individuals, is perhaps no longer impossible. In the wake of victims such as George Floyd in Minneapolis, with his phone video going viral and his monuments are coming down, I never thought I would live long enough to see that they're going to take down John C. Calhoun, who is the senator who introduced the pro-slavery and the idea that slavery is a positive good into the Senate, into the nation, really. That came up and led in the gag laws to keep it out of Congress in a discussion of slavery, who is the person responsible for making people like Lincoln, who could live with slavery as long as the founding fathers said it was necessary evil, but what Calhoun says it is the best system for all the world. Then Lincoln and others had to make a decision. And now the mayor yesterday announced that the city of Charleston wants to remove Calhoun's statue, which is the highest statue in all of Charleston and actually overlooks Mother Emanuel, which is 5 years ago. We're looking at the commemoration again of that horrible massacre by a white supremacist who was holding the Confederate flag and a picture on his Facebook flag. So there's a lot that is going on at this time. I believe we're in the midst of a real revolution, a revolution actually very similar to the civil rights movement. And when businesses and corporations during the civil rights movement decided that it was in their better interest, their business interests and for moral reasons, to no longer support segregated lunch counters or segregated department stores when African Americans had boycotted them, we did get the change that people thought was impossible. Now, we will probably never know the names of the victims of terrorism. We had the video of George Floyd and others that I have a long list. I won't go through them here. In fact, we know the story of the call of the Kennedys to Martin Luther King when he was in jail, but you have to understand what that meant. How many people like Martin Luther King who were protesting for civil rights, for justice, for change to the law, went into jail and were never heard from again. We think that terrorism in America began in 9/11, but Americans, that is African Americans, have lived in a terroristic society since 1865, at least to 1965, and the Voting Rights Act, when they began to have some way of expressing their ideas and their discomfort and changing the laws. In fact, if you think about it, when I testified for Gary in Texas, there are people alive today who go to vote, who it was dangerous in their lifetime to go to that very place to register. Think about all the Confederate monuments that stand at courthouse squares in front of the courthouse. While that might symbolize to a number of white people, ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, even died, it also symbolized to African Americans they will not find justice in that courthouse. It's a great time to be a historian of the United States, especially American South. And at this moment, as we live through this revolution, I think it's important to remember that good revolutions like this one are both exhilarating and a time for wariness. But what was impossible before or even now might actually become possible. We saw the end of segregation, the Confederate flags, the monuments being moved. I think the future's upon us, but it must be one that we can choose and see ourselves in. This requires a personal, local, national, and global effort. Maybe then reconciliation will be possible. But let us deal with the truth and repair our country and look at its history honestly first. We never had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, an opportunity as South Africa did when we ended segregation and legal apartheid. We have, of course, great examples of what can be done there, not only in South Africa, but look what Baltimore and New Orleans under Mayor Landau did about bringing people together to discuss the pros and cons of removing monuments and the dialogue. It is such a teachable moment. I think it's difficult for students today to even fathom the depth of the apartheid system or the degree of contempt for the courts, the law in the mid-20th century in the U.S. South after the 1954 Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. Now is the time, and now might also be the time for reparations. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission rooted in repair, focused on reparations, that holds hearings around the country to tell the true history of this country, not the untruths we've been told in history books, but the theft of indigenous peoples' land, to the violent horrors, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement, the violent overthrow of the interracial, democratically elected, progressive local and state governments in the Reconstruction American South. There were real coup d'etats here in the United States, and nothing was done about it. Denial of opportunities in every aspect of American life: police violence, mass incarceration, resource poor school, health disparities, unaffordable housing, etc. Now, the Bible tells us that when the Hebrew slaves were freed, the Egyptians gave them gold, silver, and fine garments. No such reception greeted America's freed slaves. No 40 acres, no mules. Instead, for generations, every effort was made to keep them shackled to white people's lands and out of white people's businesses. Finally, in the 1950s and finally in the 1960s, after more than 300 years, when the good jobs, land, housing, school, business opportunities, not least of all, money went to white people, the United States made a commitment of sorts to a national policy of freedom and racial equality. And there is historical precedent actually for reparations. Lincoln had been willing to compensate white slave owners to convince them to free their slaves. He tried to get the 4 Union states that still had slavery to free their slaves for compensation. Under Lincoln, giving land to freed people occurred. Lincoln supported Sherman's order that gave land to African Americans. The 1866 Freedmen's Bureau bill that Andrew Johnson vetoed, in fact, provided for land for freedmen. And most congressmen assumed that the 1866 Southern Homestead Act would provide a way for freedmen to get land and have the first opportunity. In 1915, Memphis attorney, African-American Cornelius J. Jones brought a class action suit against the Secretary of the Treasury, William G. McAdoo, in the local courts of Washington, D.C., and he asked for $68 million. He claimed that the U.S. had wrongfully benefited from a tax on raw cotton and that this money should be used to compensate the African Americans who had picked cotton from just 1859 to 1868 and their ancestors who had been subject to a system of involuntary servitude. That's a quote from the lawsuit. Now, the D.C. court rejected on procedural grounds. They said that McAdoo was just a custodian of the treasury. The real defendants were the United States itself, and the United States cannot be party to a lawsuit without consent, and the U.S. court upheld that. And of course, immediately after that, the United States brought an indictment against Jones for fraud when he said, asked for contribution of $1.75 from people to pursue the reparations. You also have the example of the Japanese internment. On Sunday, December 17, 1944, the government formally announced that it would begin emptying the internment camps 2 weeks later. On January 2nd, 1945, all the attorneys and people who had been interned were released with $25 and a train ticket home. Now, freedmen did not even get $25 or a train ticket. 40 years later, the United States delivered some gestures of amends. The Civil Liberty Acts of 1988 provided reparations of $20,000 each to some 80,000 camp internees who were still alive. In 1984 and 1987, Gordon Habrashi and Fred Komatsu were exonerated when federal courts reversed their wartime convictions and all charges were dismissed. Now, I think there's some creative ideas that we can use. That is, when we say to people, we could subsidize home ownership. We can learn from the mistakes of the past of trying to help people from the last recession we went into. When you think about the investments and the equity that comes out of housing, people forget that even Social Security that came during the New Deal, Southern white legislators were able to get farm workers and domestics exempted so that most blacks in the rural South were not getting Social Security. You had the racial covenants and the redlining that kept people from buying homes. With the GI Bill, African Americans couldn't attend a integrated school in Texas or any other southern state. You had redlining and those racial covenants that if they did use the GI Bill to buy a home, they could not buy a home where equity increased. Therefore, they end up in Ward 9 in New Orleans, where the flood occurred, because they have to go to places that others don't want. You can go on and on and on, but this is just one of ways I think you can be creative in arguing how reparations could be used and go to individuals as well as to communities. Well, in conclusion, my wife tells me to always say that to give some hope to the audience. Let's not forget that revolutions do go backwards, and the story of a successful implementation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and then their undoing stands as a warning for today's voters and for court interpretation. Nevertheless, let us end on a positive note with one certainty. The Constitution of the United States, with the Civil War's amendments, guiding principle of citizenship and equality, is still a foundation of a new birth of freedom. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to, in fact, just use the last sentence of the book, The Age of Lincoln, that I wrote, where we say that determine that the thing can and shall be done, wrote Lincoln, and then we shall find the way. Thank you very, very much.
Dr. Burton, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really tremendous. I think that we'll have some questions later, and I think individuals who might have questions might send them in the chat. I think Mr. Davis might be going over those later on. Let me introduce my co-moderator, who's going to introduce our second outstanding panelist, but that was indeed a wealth of information and some tremendous thoughts and ideas, both for Congressman Jackson Lee and Congressman Green, in reference to the important legislation that they both have now pending in the United States Congress in reference to addressing issues that are still pending being addressed according to Dr. Burton.